celebrated author, poet, and hero of all things school, Michael Rosen. He's a champion of education, and many of you will know him from Twitter as well. Michael is in the process today of publishing this wonderful book. It's the first ever authorised children's biography of Roald Dahl. It's called Fantastic Mr. Dahl. As a challenge, given that Roald Dahl had written the two incredibly celebrated biographies, Boy and Going Solo, how did you approach it when you were sitting down to write it yourself?
Well, I knew those two books, and I had read them and looked back at them. I also read the two big biographies that I knew well, one by Jeremy Treglone and one by Donald Sturrock. But because I was doing something that was different from both of those, in a sense, I was talking to children about him, and I had encountered him as well. I had met him a couple of times. And I also wanted to talk about what made him into a writer. When he was writing Boy, he was almost like sending himself up. He was contemplating who he was and the things that he had done and enjoying all that. And I really wanted to engage with what are the ingredients that make a writer, make any writer, but in particular what made him. So I'm looking at it, if you like, through that telescope, through that prism, which he wasn't doing. He wanted to tell a good story about himself. So I did want to do a bit of that, but I also wanted to concentrate on this writing side of him. That's why I was drawn to his letters. Here's somebody writing home once a week while he's away at boarding school. And he scarcely refers to that in his autobiography, but I was very interested in that because that's the sort of substance, if you like, of him getting to learn how to write, discover an audience, all that.
How did the book come about? Was it your idea or the publisher's idea?
If only I could say that. If only I could boast that this was some brilliant idea that I had. But no, not so clever. No, this came from the people at the Roald Dahl Museum and Archive, the Roald Dahl Foundation and Puffin Books, and they came to me because I'd written a biography for children about that bloke, Shakespeare, and another one, Dickens. And they thought I kind of hadn't done a bad job there. So why shouldn't I have a go at Roald Dahl? So yeah, that's how it came about. I thought of 20 other people who could do a better job, and they didn't take any notice of that, and said, well, even though you are the 21st, why not have a go?
Fantastic. We've got some questions coming in.
Yes.
This is one from Karen Doherty.
Hello, Karen.
Of all Dahl's many fabulous characters, which has been your favourite?
Well, I'm very fond, as you might guess, very fond of revolting rhymes and dirty beasts. I'm pretty fond of the pig. I just think this pig, he's an existential pig, He sits there and he contemplates, why was he born? What is he in this world for? And then he figures out that he's here in actual fact for other people's purposes, for the bacon, for the chitterlings, and then resolves to do something about it. So he's a rebel. I like him. So I think probably, though it's not from the fiction, it's the pig. From the fiction, if I'm feeling sort of soft-edged, then I'll go for Danny in Danny, Champion of the World. And if I'm feeling a little bit more kind of wild, then probably it's Mrs. Twit. I think Mrs. Twit feeding Mr. Twit live worms to go in amongst his spaghetti and seeing the expression on my little boy's face as I read this, particularly the point at which Mrs. Twit then says, "And I've just given you worms." And when she tells him, I just think it's just so wonderful. Most people's tricks, you then leave the worms and then get out of it. But she just says, "Look, I just fed you worms." His face was so funny. It was funnier than the book in a way. But anyway, so I suppose it's those two.
Fantastic. Yeah. Another one here from Adriana Blake. What is your favourite story from Dahl's childhood? So this is your research, I suppose.
Yes. I guess, well, obviously, as he tells the story, the Great Mouse Plot, how the boys at St. Peter's School drop the mouse in the sweetie jar. You have to take it with a slight pinch of salt. Did he just slightly tweak it? Did they really do it? Did Miss Twitchett really get the mouse out? So we never know exactly for sure. From his letters home, I think the funniest one is the one where he hears from his mum that she's doing the painting. She's painting the house and possibly painting the toilet, which of course he calls the lav in 1920s, 1930s slang. And he warns her not to paint the toilet seat. Because it'll end up sticking to her bum, and she'll walk around the house with the toilet seat stuck to her bum for the rest of her life or something. I mean, it seems so Roald Dahl, and there he is as a teenager, you know, writing to his mum like that. And you think this is the 1920s. We all talk to our mums like this nowadays, you know. You don't know how children talk to their mums, but, you know, in those days, there couldn't have been any other boys at his school who would have talked to their mums about toilet seats sticking to their bum. You know, this was like, you know, these people were born in Victorian times, the mums. And you wouldn't have dreamt of talking, but, you know, he came from a very informal, you know, off-the-wall type of house. So I love that. I love that letter. I think it's very funny.
Fantastic. This is from someone called Gail. You speak very fondly of Roald Dahl, as we know, elsewhere as well. Is he who you modelled yourself on when you decided to become a writer?
No, not at all. I think I might get a bit pompous now. Modelling myself as a writer of poems, I was trying to model myself on all sorts of people, mostly Americans, people like Carl Sandburg, who's not very well known in this country, D.H. Lawrence's poems. So I was sort of fitting in somewhere around there. When it came to writing some fiction, I don't think I was really thinking of Dahl, though funnily enough, we were grouped together when I'd written a story about a giant flea and he had written the twits. There we were, people thinking that maybe there was something in common, but I don't think I modelled myself on him or his writing. No, and of course I hadn't read him as a child. As I always point out to children, I was born in the Stone Age, and in the Stone Age we didn't know Roald Dahl. No. So I only got to know Roald Dahl, as it were, when I started reading to my children.
So your kids?
Yes,
and
exactly.
They reacted immediately, presumably.
Oh, absolutely, yes. It was extraordinary, really. It's like a kind of illness almost, the way you see children take Dahl. They can't quite believe, even something like George's Marvellous Medicine, it seems like hardly a story to an adult, and yet the idea of distorting your grandmother's body into this being, it's outrageous, it's awful. How could you possibly... Exactly, it's marvellous. How could you possibly write it? Well, you could if you're Roald Dahl. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Another one coming from Twitter, this one, it's at Yellow Door, whatever that means. What can you tell about a person from their favourite Roald Dahl novel?
Yes, you probably can. I mean, it's like any taste things, isn't it? It's like Desert Island Discs. It's like any of these things, that if you hear what people like, it is a part of your personality. It is. You wrap yourself up. If you say, well, you know, I couldn't possibly live without listening to Beethoven's Fifth every so often, then, you know, it does tell you something about what people want and need. And I suppose about Roald Dahl, because it's so extreme, you know, he did work through exaggeration, you know, hyperbole as the Greeks called it. He did work through that, that if there's some aspect of Roald Dahl you like, in a way you're saying it's a thing about life or people's foibles, that you like the fact that he's exaggerated it in order to show it in such an extreme light. So whether it's about you or whether it's somebody you know, we would have to know that person a little bit better to find out, wouldn't we? Yeah.
Absolutely. In your experience, what Roald Dahl stories do children like most and why? So which ones are their favourite?
Yes, it's quite often Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and I suppose I could use my barometer of the taxi driver on this one. Because what keeps happening is I get into a cab and the bloke's looking at me in the mirror and he says, oh, I think I know you are, you write children's books, or something like that. Or they say, what do you do? I say, I write children's books, and they're looking in the mirror and they say, oh, right, you're Roald Dahl, or something like that. I think they now know that Roald Dahl's died, but a few years ago it was that. And then they'd say, somewhere within the next minute or two, that they read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. They loved Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It was the only book they ever bought, quite often. This is, you know, taxi driver sample. And it changed their life in some way or another. They read it, and that made them into the person they were. I mean, it's amazing, you know, the number of people who talk about it as if it's a sort of debt that they owe to him. Yeah. So I think Charlie is quite often the first one. And I think what they like about it is it's basically the Cinderella story. It's the underdog, the least, I don't know, fortunate person. Yeah. And then he gets the lucky break, and it happens for him. And then the idea that it's, you know, the gold ticket and the chocolate, it's sort of, it's quite a child's dream. Yes, it is. Yeah, the token, the thing that enables you, the lottery ticket. So I suppose it's probably Charlie that is their favourite, though I think one of my kids really liked the BFG. I know that was one. And it was his favourite. It was his own favourite, I think. I think that was the book that he liked himself the most.
We've got one from a Janet Mills. Do you think Roald Dahl's novels would have been as popular if there was less burping, farting and snot?
Burping, snarting, burping, and yes, that's right. Snurting, farting, and snot. Yes. I don't know, because the burping and farting stuff, it came a bit later. Mm-hmm. I think he didn't realise he could get away with it until a bit later. I mean, once he had got himself into a position of some power where whatever he wrote they would want to print, I think then he started popping that stuff in. I think, yeah, I mean, it's part of the popularity. Of course it is, because so long as we adults make those things taboo, then it becomes interesting for children. If we say to children, now don't burp, then obviously it gets very exciting. In fact, my oldest boy has taught... what did my little chap say to me, my 7-year-old, as I walked in today? He said, "Do you know Joe," that's the 35-year-old, "can burp the alphabet?" Now, as it happens, he's brought up in a home where, nobody's bothered about burping, but there's obviously enough taboo around, you're not allowed to burp in school, I suppose, for him to think that is amazing achievement and really exciting and funny. And obviously farting is just stunning. I mean, it's just brilliant. I mean, and of course, if you think about the history of how these things have been written about in literature, it's the idea of inversion. It's upside down. We talk with our mouths. So if you make these other noises with other parts of your body, it's like turning you upside down. It's like Hieronymus Bosch. You're creating an opposite. It's the world turned upside down. And, clever writers for children, they find ways of turning the world upside down, and it makes children laugh, because all the time as adults, we're trying to bring them up with the world turned up the right way. So when they turn upside down, we stand them up again properly and say, sit up. What a strange idea, yes. Sit up. As Ivor Cutler once said, how can you sit up when you're sitting down? And it's all that upside down stuff. And he knew what he was doing, create upside down stuff, make the BFG talk in nonsense language. Yeah. People love it.
Fantastic. This is from @Padgewire on Twitter, I presume. It said, and it's in your book as well, that Dahl could only write with a particular yellow pad and a particular yellow pencil. This is really about you, actually. @Padgewire wants to know if there's any conditions that you really need when you're being creative, when you're writing.
No, I have in fact learned to write something or other almost under any conditions. So buses, trains, in the house, with the telly on, in this country, in another country, it could be almost anywhere. I can't write anything under those circumstances, but pretty nearly anything. I mean, sitting in the corner over there is the lady who's worked very hard on the publicity to do with this book, and I get, emails at about 11 at night saying, you haven't done the... And so just as I'm about... In fact, I am fast asleep when I receive it. So then I write this article for The Guardian or something about what I'm supposed to do while I'm asleep. So it reaches Anwen at about 3 in the morning. So it's almost any conditions. Awake, asleep, at home, abroad, with at least 3 children on my lap, total and complete silence. Any conditions anywhere.
Fantastic. That's no small achievement.
Thank you. I'm not saying it's any good. I'm not saying it's any kind of writing. Yeah.
This is from Karen. In your research about Dahl, what discovery surprised you the most? That's a good question. I'd like to know.
Yes. I don't think I fully... What can I say? I don't think I fully understood this thing about what he was doing in America. Yes. And chatting and reading, I kind of got a better picture on it. So what had happened, he'd been in the RAF, and then because he'd had the crash, when he crashed his plane, in the end he shipped out of the RAF. He couldn't go on flying. So it's a kind of parallel story to the Douglas Bader story, really.
Yes,
he'd had the bad crash, they bunged him up in the plane again, he carried on fighting, then they took him out, and then he seems to have had one of those little chats with somebody at the Admiralty who thought that he was a bright fellow, and then they sent him off to America. Well, what was he doing in America? And I never fully understood. Well, of course, at that time, this is after Pearl Harbor, but the British weren't 100% convinced that the Americans were totally wholehearted about being in the war. And after all, they had good reason to know this, because Roosevelt seemed to want to be in the war, but plenty of other Americans in the White House and so on, in the government, weren't 100% keen. And in fact, there were some people who thought that America should be on the side of the Germans.
Yes, indeed.
So Dahl's role was to, as it were, sell to the Americans the idea they should be in the war, and one of the reasons was to point out to the Americans what a terrible state Britain was in and how rough life was and being bombed and so on. And so basically it was his job to go and kind of schmooze the Americans and tell them, and somehow or other, he found his way into the upper echelons of Hollywood, showbiz, and of course the American government. I mean, there he was, hanging out with the Roosevelts, playing tennis with the vice pres, schmoozing Walt Disney, hanging out with film stars, and you just think, and he was technically a spy. I mean, as far as we know, he was sending back intelligence reports saying, yeah, I think they're on board, guys, I think we got them. And also he was placing stories in things like the New Yorker about the bombing in London and so on. So, and having a time of his life.
Yeah, met his wife there as well, didn't he?
Yes, indeed. That's where he met Patricia Neal, the actress, who, of course, he went on to marry and have his children with. Yeah.
We've got this is from John, age 9.
Hello, John.
Do you think any of Roald Dahl's books would be better with a different ending? Now, this is interesting because you refer to the fact that he had several different storylines for lots of different books that he toyed with.
Well, it's a very interesting question, John, because very nearly all children's books, they kind of end okay. You can almost think, pretty nearly all children's books that, the baddie gets dealt with and all things work out all right. But Roald Dahl, he took some risks. I don't know whether you've read The Witches, John, and I'm not going to spoil the ending because it's a bit of a surprise. So much of a surprise that when they made the film about it, they changed the ending. So that's all I'm going to say for the moment. And he got away with it. And you can see from his notebooks that he kept thinking about how can you get a good ending to a book. And it is very difficult. Anyone will tell you that it's almost the hardest part of writing any novel, any longish book or even a short story, is to get the ending so that somehow or other you feel that's good. And he played tricks with the endings of some of his books. Yeah,
that's great. Simon Walker asks, do you think the BFG is how Roald Dahl imagined himself? And you sort of allude to that in the book as well, don't you?
Yeah, it's not so much as how he imagined himself. If you think that, all writers do this, what you do is you reimagine things about yourself. So let's say you think of yourself as this person with big hands, then you can reimagine yourself as someone with tiny little hands and you haven't got big hands at all. Or on the other hand, you can exaggerate it and you have the most enormous hands in the world. Well, he was up the other end. He was up the big hands end. So when he said, I am a tall bloke who sometimes comes up with nutty ideas and I collect people's dreams and thoughts, and I sometimes get my language a bit muddled because I'm bilingual and I can mix up languages any way I want to. We could say that he reimagined himself as the BFG, and in fact we know he kind of did a bit of role play first because when Sophie, his granddaughter, Sophie Dahl, came to stay with her mum, that's Tessa, his daughter, Roald's daughter, he started playing tricks. He got a ladder and then in the middle of the night climbed up the ladder to her bedroom and called through the window, being the BFG. So he did a bit of role play first, so he had a chance to, as you say, imagine himself. And then I think the way it comes out in the books is that he's created this, I think he's made himself, if it is himself, a kind of slightly more naive, isn't he? Because the lovely BFG's got a kind of naivety about him.
Childlike.
Yes, that's right. He's quite innocent. I quite like the idea that he's opposed to the other giants. I suppose Dahl probably saw himself as an outsider.
Yeah.
And in some respects he was. If you think, he went to these very English private schools, what we call public schools, went to an English public school, but he was Norwegian. Part of him was very strongly Norwegian. His mother spoke to him in Norwegian. He spent his holidays in Norway. He was bilingual as a child. There were one or two others around at the schools that he would have identified with and seen. There was one boy, I think, who had been born in possibly the Lebanon, if I remember rightly, that he hung out with. I may have not remembered that correctly. That he kind of did gravitate towards these other people who were a bit outside. You think some of those boys at those schools, their dads, their granddads, their great-granddads had been at public schools. They'd played cricket. They'd done all those English things. He didn't do any of those English things at home.
No.
And when he went on holiday, You know, he describes in Boy, you know, the food that he ate, you know, kind of raw herring or whatever it was that he ate in Norway and so
Amazing,
on.
yeah.
The other boys, you know, by and large wouldn't have done that. They'd have gone home and had toast and tea, you know.
Yes.
And you don't, I mean, I know that a bit about myself in the sense I'm Jewish in background, and there are all sorts of things I did being at school where there weren't any other Jewish kids, that they would come over and go, well, what's that you're doing? I'm saying, well, I'm eating pickled herring. And they go, "Ah!" You know, what are those big green things? Well, those are pickled cucumbers. "Ah!" Well, you know, Dahl would have had that feeling.
Absolutely, that's interesting. He's actually, yeah. Anyway, Giles writes, did Roald Dahl have any more stories planned before he died? Because there's a sort of melancholic bit towards the end of your book when it's like he's almost handing over the baton. Isn't it?
Well, in a sense, the answer is yes. He had hundreds of ideas, not just one key story. Is that when you look at his notebooks, I mean, you're looking at such a kind of fertile landscape. I mean, every page of his notebooks are covered in ideas for stories, for poems, for jokes, for, you know, disgusting tricks. I mean, it's like, seriously, it's quite extraordinary. So, I mean, I think potentially there are many, and also some false starts as well, and alternative endings and bits of other stories that he might have cannibalized and used for new stories. So, yes, let's imagine that Roald Dahl lived to 120. I think there'd have been another, you know, at least another 30 stories there.
Well, we missed out, didn't
Yeah,
we?
we did, yeah. There's this trouble, you know, these limits to our existence. It's, you know, it wasn't fair of whoever devised us.
Absolutely. No. Well, just thought I'd say to people, can we get some more questions in using the hashtag TES chat, or if you're backwards, using the email help@ts.co.uk. Karen Doherty asked the question, revolting rhymes is one of my favourite Dahl delights. It makes me laugh. What makes you laugh?
Sounds like something quite similar to you, Karen. Yeah, I love revolting rhymes and Dirty Beast. I think I possibly like Dirty Beasts even more, really, because he's had to sort of start from scratch there, and done wonderfully. What makes me laugh in general? I'm mad keen on stand-up comedy, good stand-up comedy. Really? I think the first time I saw Dylan Moran, I was helpless. Absolutely. I saw him at the Edinburgh Festival, and just that volley of language and thought, I just thought this is the most cleverest, funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. So if that gives you an idea, Dylan Moran, I'm not sure he's still doing stand-up, but I saw him...
He did Black Books, didn't he?
That's right, which I don't think, you know, did himself justice. I know he wrote it, but I mean, I think he was so much funnier in stand-up. So I saw him for 2 years running, so that he... And when very first time I ever saw Billy Connolly, which was quite early on in his career, I couldn't believe it. I just thought, where has this come from? And I suppose this goes back to the way in which, at home, my dad was something of a kind of anecdotalist. He loved it. It was a sort of home stand-up.
Yeah.
You know, we would do something on holiday, and then he would turn it into this sort of episode that he entertained people with. So he was actually a bit of a sort of domestic stand-up comedian, my dad. So I kind of think I learnt that kind of humour from him. And so then when I see it in others doing it, I particularly like kind of anecdote type people, and also people who go off on a surreal one, like Ross Noble.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
Just wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I just love looking and hearing Ross Noble. I've seen him on live at the Apollo, and I think that's something very, very special, that kind of humour. So, yeah, all that.
Fantastic. Mark Howard asks, are many of Dahl's characters based on his own children? Was Sophie from Mathilda based on Sophie Dahl?
Yes, and yes, I think we say based on. I think what he did, he sort of wrote 2 or 3 of the books for them. I think that's the way you could say, which is not quite basing the character. I mean, you know, after all, we got Mathilda there with these revolting parents, you know, and not just revolting, but he made them sort of extra revolting, with the dad, this kind of absolute crook, and the mum, self-obsessed, sort of vain person. Yes, I think I don't know, I'd be treading on some toes here. I mean, Tessa Dahl is writing her own bits of autobiography,
really?
isn't she? Well, she writes articles in the paper and so on, and talks about her life, and I wouldn't want to sort of go there, really, but I don't think he based anything actually on his children. I think he, as I say, he kind of directed the books a bit towards them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very nice. And how lucky they were. This is quite a difficult question, so if you want to skip it, do, because it's asking a lot off the top of your head. But Karen asks, if you could ask Roald Dahl 3 questions now, what would they be? Putting you on the spot.
Yes, what would I ask Roald Dahl now?
What were you
I
doing
think
there?
I would. No, I know. I would really like to talk to him about the Norwegian side of his life, because he rarely spoke about it, as far as I know. I mean, everybody who I know to do with the family, they can tell you stuff, but I'd be interested just to hear him chat about Norway and what he thought about all that Norwegian stuff, because by and large in interviews with him, nobody ever asked him. It doesn't seem to be of any interest, and yet there he was going every summer as a child, and I'd like it to hear him speak Norwegian.
Yes.
I'd like to have heard him tell me a story in Norwegian, just to hear what it would sound like. And then I'd like to know part of that. It's all part of the same question. I'd like to hear exactly which stories his mum told him, because I know some of the Norse god stories because I read them as a child. And I think there was a book, I think I read in Donald Starrick's biography, one particular book, and I'd like to get hold of that book. But I don't think it's in English, you see. So I'd like to know. There was one book of trolls and sort of wicked creatures that she told him about that was her favourite book. So I'd like to ask him about that. And then I suppose there's a highly contentious issue about Roald Dahl's attitude to Jews and anti-Semitism and all that stuff. And I guess I would be quite interested in having a conversation about that.
I was actually going to ask you about
I'm
that.
sure we'd have a pretty good little tête-à-tête about that.
Was he really anti-Semitic, do you believe?
He said some things. He said, well, let's leave the right and left out, because he was such a maverick. There's some things he said that you could describe as left-wing. He was very anti-war when he came out of the war. He was very anti the regime of public school. When he writes about the regime of the public school, he almost sounds like a kind of left socialist talking about public schools. On the other hand, he said some other things you might interpret as right-wing. He was a maverick, that was the point. He was sort of to one side of a lot of things in society. And when it comes to this Jewish thing, of course, he said some things that, I would find offensive, either about Jews in all or perhaps about individuals. On the other hand, as they say, some of his best friends were Jews, which doesn't make you, as it were, that's what he would have said, I know, because, his agent, various other people were Jews who said, no, there's no way a man like that is really anti-Semitic, because, we go out, we drink, we have fun, and he never for any moment said, but that's the notion that anti-Semitism is just about hating all Jews, including the ones you know. But, racism doesn't work like that. Oh, look, there's somebody trying to ring me. Sorry. No, I'm on air, mate. Sorry, can't do that. Turn that one off. Oh, look, it's Anwen in the corner. She's ringing me, telling me to write something. So, it's a conversation I would love to have had with him. I think it was a complicated bit of a mess in his head, to be absolutely honest, as it often is with plenty of people. There were these terrible things that happened, obviously, during the Second World War, don't we know? And people get all kind of snarled up about it. And I suppose I'd be quite interested in mingling with the snarl up.
Yeah, nicely put.
Needless to say, I haven't really written about this at all in the book. It wasn't really a thing that seemed relevant to the books or to do with his growing up. It's something that came up quite late on in his life when he made some statements about Jews and about Israel and so on, and it just didn't seem to be an area that was relevant to the book, so I didn't bring it up. Yeah.
I was wondering whether you would.
And also, Donald Starrick's explored it very, very well for adults in the adult biography. So if our adults are interested in it, look in the index, I suppose J for Jew, and you'll find it there. Yeah.
This is a nice question from Emily, age 7. If you could have a superpower like Mathilda, what would it be?
It would be that every time Arsenal played, at a key moment, I would be able to make sure that of all the hundreds of shots on goal that Arsenal have, always more than almost any other team, that at least one of them would go in. So now that we've lost Robin van Persie, this may be very boring to you, Emily. I don't know, not everybody loves football, but I would make sure that all those Arsenal players who keep missing the goal would occasionally score.
That's a good one. This is from Lillian. Do you think Roald Dahl's stories would have been as popular if they were first published 20 years earlier or 20 years later?
20 years later, yes. 20 years earlier, no. I think when I was a child, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So look, I was born in 1946, so let's imagine these books started coming out late 40s, early 50s. I just don't think we'd have known what to do with them. I think they would have appeared, we thought, it may not mean anything to you, Lillian, but there's a set of stories about somebody called Jennings, who was a boy at private school, and Billy Bunter, and people like that. And if there were sort of things vaguely naughty there, we thought that was a bit wild. I don't think we'd have known what to do with them 20 years earlier, and I doubt, actually, to be honest, whether he'd been able to publish them.
Yes. Was he in some ways part of the sort of 60s and 70s cultural changes?
I think he is. I think you can say that one of the cultural changes that has occurred is that those grown-ups who are concerned with the bringing up of children, by and large, parents, grandparents and teachers, we've relaxed many things. If you go back to just my own schooling, the formality of it and the secrecy of it and the very constrained quality of the way in which schools were run and how we just even held ourselves in school. All this was very, very formal stuff. And, of course, this got broken down a lot by the 60s, which I lived through. And you could see it happening. And, of course, people who had been at school or at university in the 60s then became teachers and parents, like myself. And we didn't want to go back to some of that formality. So, and Dahl himself, I mean, when you look at his childhood and you hear the stories about how his mum brought him up, she was a very informal woman. Yep. People used to come over to the house and they'd be amazed. They were telling rude jokes. How could a woman who was born in Victorian times have her children walking around the house telling fart jokes? And yet they did. Yeah. And it seemed incredible to people of Roald Dahl's generation that could go on in what seemed like an ordinary suburban or village house, like you got in Great Missenden. So, yes, I think in a sense he was ahead of his time by being of this slightly outlandish, as it seemed then, and then found a home in this post-60s generation of parents like myself.
Absolutely. Our very own Pookie has decided to slip one in.
Pookie! Great name, by the way, Pookie. We like the name.
Thank you.
If Pookie asks, she could ask for herself, but if Pookie asks, if Roald Dahl had been alive in the age of social media, how might he have incorporated it into his stories? So Twitter, Facebook, and the like. Do you think he would have dealt with the interaction? Because he was quite isolated when he wrote, wasn't he?
Yes.
He hid himself away.
Yes, but he was pretty keen. If you think about his relationship with technology, if you think of the awful accident that his little boy suffered in New York, Theo, and the accident damaged his head, damaged his skull and so on, and as a result he was get what we call water on the brain, hydroencephalitis. And here is this guy, there's no training at all. Here's this guy, he didn't do much science, he left school, and he immediately applies himself to the what we call medical technology of what Theo's suffering from. And then he sits there and he works it out with surgeons and watchmakers. He works out this extraordinary little valve that can go into Theo's skull. In the end, it didn't, into his head, in order to automatically drain and self-clean. Extraordinary piece of apparatus. It was used by some people. These days, it's regulated with drugs. But it was a wonderful little device that he helped devise. So with that in mind, and with the fact that he was so keen on the written word, I just imagine, of course, he would have had a Facebook site. And he wrote to children. What are we saying here? Children wrote to him. He was much better than I am. And he wrote back to the children. And he sat there, and told them, gave them advice, and told them to write and read and enjoy themselves and make sure that their parents were sparky and all the rest of it. And he sent off these letters. So, yeah, I think he'd have been a Facebook and Twitter person, I'm sure.
We missed out.
He did. We did. He did. Yeah, we all did. We all missed out. He'd have been... Yes, I think he'd have found a way of putting it so that he created new things that way. I think that's what he had done. He probably would have devised a Facebook book where he would write a chapter a month or something. It'd have been like Dickens, that who would produce a chapter a fortnight, I think,
newspaper, yeah.
in his magazine. That's right. What was it called? Monthly Morning Chronicle, something like that. He would probably have done something like that. Yes.
Have you ever been tempted? Have you ever done anything like that?
Well, I do spend a lot of time on Twitter and so on, and then I collect up my tweets sometimes.
At Michael Rosen, yes.
Yes, that's right. I collect up the tweets and then I sort of recirculate them. So, I'm thinking a lot about it, really. I think that potentially it's a fantastic form. It's always the question, as my dear son always tells me, but how do you make a living, Dad? Which is a very good point. You know, I put out my poems on YouTube via my website, and, you know, they've had nearly 4 million hits, and, of course, not a penny earned. And you think that's 4 million times people have gone, oh, I like that poem, I'm going to watch that. Or maybe not, actually, of course, they could just look at it and go, oh, that's awful. But never mind, I ought at least to get... Yeah. And, you know, it's, well, I mean, 4 million quid would be all right, wouldn't it?
Yeah, £1 a poem.
Yeah, but in fact, 0. So anyway, so I've cracked the new media, but haven't cracked the earnings.
Yeah, well, I think that's true of just about everyone.
Yes, I think so.
You can tell that a lot of these are written by teachers. At Podgewire asks, did Dahl being bilingual help with his inventive languages, do you suppose?
I am sure of it. I think that people who have more than one language to go to are then, in a way, in a very interesting position in relation to language itself. Most of the time we use language as if it doesn't exist. We use it just simply as the means by which you do things. So you just say, thanks very much for the cup of tea, and you don't think about cup of tea, how you said it, you just say it, and the words refer to the thank you and to the tea and the cup. And then, you know, teachers and the rest of it, we go, oh, that's interesting. We say a cup of tea, we don't say a cup of. My word, isn't that interesting? Or isn't it interesting, it's got a little rhythm, thanks very much for the cup of tea, or we draw ourselves, and then we say, and all that. But then, if you speak another language, you suddenly think about, well, how do you say that in another language? And if you occupy another language so completely that you're bilingual, you can, as it were, look from one language back across to another one with all of it.
Yeah.
And suddenly language is this thing that has its own existence. He was like that. He knew that every word, you know, that he was using, there was a Norwegian equivalent.
Yeah.
He would have a way of saying it. And I think when you think about him writing, you know, the BFG, you know, but really kind of a lot of the BFG is actually about language.
Yeah.
It's about the fact that these people speak, these giants have got another language, and look how much Sophie is laughing and how much she likes it, and she's giggling and enjoying the fact, and you know, and she says, what are they? And then he says, you know, what do you mean you don't know what they are?
Yeah.
You know, these are the encounters with strange languages that, you know, and strangeness that he would have known himself. So yes, and I think that when it comes to him writing, in particular the poems, you know, he had a fantastic ear. Those poems are, you know, quite similar in some respects to Hilaire Belloc's Cautionary Verses. Mm-hmm. And you can see in his writing home, he's very drawn to the teachers who put on shows of, you know, there's one guy, one of his teachers seems to be putting on the whole of Measure for Measure single-handedly. He does a sort of, you know, one-man show of Measure for Measure, and you can see he's pretty interested and impressed by it. You know, I could imagine some of the other boys just thought, well, when can we get out on the rugby field again, you know, but he's, whoa, that looks interesting to me. So, you know, what's he drawn to there? Was it the performance? Was it the language? The fact that, you know, obviously Shakespearean language is kind of odd and extraordinary. So I think there's no question that his bilingualism has got a big role to play. Yeah.
Did he like the other arts? Did he like the theatre?
Oh,
did he ever write plays?
He loved, well, he did screenplays, didn't he? You see?
Of course,
he did
You
Chitty
Only Live
Chitty Bang
Twice.
Bang, and He Only Lived Twice, that's right. In terms of his own personal life, he absolutely adored art. There was a lot of art in his family. If you again look at the Stark biography, you'll see that his forebears collected art. So various people in his Norwegian side of the family, Norwegian relatives are collecting art, and he absolutely adored music. So those two things, you know, he played music all the time, on gramophone records, that is, and art. He absolutely adored art. So those were certainly two of the arts that he liked very much. Yeah.
Aidan Bowen writes a question which is covered in the book. He asks, do you think The Great Mouse Plot is a true story? It's interesting because in the book you talk about his relationship with the truth which I thought was very interesting. I personally never thought about it.
He says that he tells the truth, but I've forgotten his exact words, but he says something like he tweaks it. That he's true to the story, but you've got to give him a little bit of license to exaggerate it a bit. What do I think about The Great Mouse Plot? My guess is the boys talked about what they would do.
Yeah.
My guess is they may even have gone to the shop with the mouse. But I've got a funny feeling that probably they didn't actually drop it in the jar, and Miss Twitchett didn't take it out. That would just be a feeling.
Yeah.
But, I mean, goodness knows. I mean, boys in the 1920s and 30s, they got up to all sorts of tricks and incredible things, and I think, I think about my own childhood and stuff I got up to. So it's not impossible, by any means. It's not impossible. So I think probably my hunch is 60-40 against it actually happening. But if somebody could prove it and say, yes, it definitely did, I'll go along with it. I mean, my dad wrote about some adventures that he got up to with his cousin, and I always believed them 100%. And when I met his cousin, I said, so, Murray, when Harold, as my dad, wrote about that, was it, well, that's true? And he just looked at me and he said, poetic license. So, yeah.
It goes without saying, really, that lots of the people online are interested in you being hugely popular.
Yeah, hello.
As well as
hello, people interested in me, yes.
As well as the other great man. So we've got a question here all the way, the magic of social media, from Australia. Joanne Barnes asks, where do you get your ideas from?
At one level or another, you don't really know, and then at the other level, it seems sort of immediately very kind of obvious. You're walking about, something happens, you either hear something, you see something, somebody tells you something, or you're just in a daydream. And you're in a daydream and you get a memory. And that first bit, it's all quite ordinary, really. It's just what everybody does. You see something, you go, oh, that's interesting. And then you go home and you tell your partner, you say, hey, something funny happened today. I saw a bloke fall off a bike or something, and you tell that story. And for most writers, it's very similar. Now, the really intriguing and odd thing is what you do with it. I mean, the jargon word for it is how do you transform your sources. So whatever your source is, how do you then turn it into something that people want to read, and so on. And that is a complicated matter because it's very much determined by the shape that you're going to put it in. So if you're somebody who writes poems, then you're already thinking, how do I poemify it? How do I poemify this thing where the bloke fell off the bike? If you write stories, then you'll be thinking, how will that appear in a story? Will it be the story of the man who fell off the bike? Would that be a good beginning, or would that be a good ending, or would there be, and so on? So that then becomes much more intriguing and complicated, and very much determined by the kinds of things you read and the kinds of audiences you imagine will read what you write. But to start off with, the ideas collecty bit, it's really just what everybody does all the time. We can't, as human beings, stop ourselves from doing it. We just looking and feeling and seeing, and we collect it up, and then we tell other people about it. That's what we are. We're social beings, and we do it. And in my experience, writers are like that.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm told we need to wrap it up, but we've got one more question, if that's all right. And given it's from Millie in Year 6.
Millie, Year 6.
We really
Hello, Millie.
To ask you, if you could make a marvellous medicine, what would it contain? Interestingly, not what would it do?
Yes, what would it, right. So let's assume, Millie, shall we, that I'm not about to poison my grandmother. Heaven forbid. So I'm just going to make an incredible medicine, yes? Okay, so am I going to like this medicine? Yes, of course I am. So it's going to have something made, it's a bit odd really now, okay, so you've got to have to forgive me here, Millie. Something or other made with chickpeas. I'm very, very fond of chickpeas. So anything, either chickpeas themselves, and of course chickpeas go into something called hummus, and they go into something called falafel or falafel. So I think I've probably got hummus in there. So that's number one. I'm very keen on honey, which I have to try and avoid eating too much of it because you just blow up like a balloon. So maybe some very sort of musky honey, you know, the honey that when you can buy in the countryside, particularly in France, and when you smell it, you kind of, so it's honey, hummus. Now, I like sort of strong flavours, strong pickled flavours, so I think we might have to throw in a pickled herring or a raw herring. In Holland, there's any Dutch people watching, they'll know anyway, that when you go to the Dutch coast, people sell you raw herring and onion. And it is wonderful. I love it. So I think we'll throw in a raw herring.
Lovely.
Now, there's a food that a lot of Jewish people eat called chopped liver. Okay, so look, I'm trying not to make you sick here. Okay, so chopped liver is absolutely lovely. In Yiddish, you call it gehackte. And I absolutely adore it. It's sort of like a liver paste or a liver sausage. It's a bit like that. So I think we'll chuck some of that in. I like the kind of cider that smells a bit like wee.
So do I.
Okay, I don't like the sweet stuff. So we've got in this stuff, there is a word for it, it's called scrumpy. So we're going to chuck in some scrumpy. How are we doing, Millie? Do you think we've got our marvellous medicine?
Sounds like a delicious combination.
Yes, and I think this is for me. And then I'm going to drink up this medicine, and other people around are going to leave the room. Do you know, Millie, I eat this stuff called pickled herring, and I remember sitting down once to pickled herring, and my boys were in the room, my older boys, and they left the room. They so couldn't stand the sight of me eating pickled herring. They said, "We're going, Dad," and they left. So, yeah, I do eat strange things.
Sounds brilliant. One more very quick question. What is the biggest trick you ever carried out as a child? A la the maths trick.
Oh, wow. The biggest trick. I can remember a trick that my brother used to play on me. I'll try you on this one. My brother said that he had a magic bar over his bed. And when he woke up in the morning, he'd say, I need to pull myself up with my magic bar. And then he would do this. He would grab hold of the magic bar and then go, like that, you see? And I'd say, well, that's rubbish, you haven't got a magic bar. And he'd say, I have, you see, and then he'd do it all over again. And then when he went out the room, I would then go,
it wasn't there.
And I'd say, well, I didn't believe him for a minute. So that worked. My brother's, he was good at tricks like that. Yeah. And I tell you what I've done. Yes. I don't know whether I can tell this one.
Oh.
I'll have a go, yes. You know, any of you watching, you'll know that mums and dads, at some point or another, have to explain the facts of life to their children. You know, it's all those things that how we came to be in the world and so on. And when my boy was 18, and I should point out he did know the facts of life already. He'd been taught them at school. I'll just leave it at that for the moment. And he knew plenty about the facts of life, put it that way. But when he was 18, I said to him, it was Eddie, my son, and I said to him, Eddie, you're 18, you're an adult. I wonder if we can just go and sit in the front room together. And he looked at me, you see, absolutely kind of slightly sort of shocked, you see, and he sat down and I said, I don't know, Eddie, whether I've ever talked to you about your mother and me and how it was that you were made. And he just burst out laughing because I was able to have him, trick him up until the point where it was made. And then when I said made, he said, you, like that, because I'd got him all the way to that point that here was this serious chat we're going to make. Anyway, so that was good. That was a good trick to play, yes. Yeah.
So we're going to have to wrap up. I've got a couple of bits of bookkeeping for all of you out there. The first one is that we will be... three bits of bookkeeping. There is a Puffin Virtually Live webcast, which I don't think will be hugely dissimilar to this, which will feature not only Michael but Quentin Blake at www.puffinvirtuallylive.co.uk on the 24th of September at 2 p.m, so be there. We will get these lovely books signed for you and sent out ASAP. And not least of all, and quite exciting as well, we have Henry Winkler, a.k.a. The Fonz, joining us in a similar place, i.e. here, at the same time next week on the 18th. I think that's right, isn't it? So all that's left is for me to say thank you very much, Michael.
Thank
you for coming in.
No, thank you very much.
To everyone else for joining us, and it's been brilliant.
Thank you very much indeed. Lovely. And thank you, all you folks who wrote in. Thank you.